He is a teaching elder at Christ Church, Moscow, regularly preaching at their downtown service. Dr. Merkle is the author of The White Horse King and Defending the Trinity in the Reformed Palette May. Hopefully I said that right. He and his wife, Rebecca, have 5 children and a growing generation of grandchildren. So very good. Please welcome Dr. Ben Merkle.
Well, good morning. It's a privilege to be with you all. I got to spend time last summer with your students, and I think the secondary staff in the camp leading up to school, which was a total blast and a good memory for us. I think the night that the bear tried to get into the cabin still looms large. It didn't realize it was a bear until the next morning. In my mind, I had a dream that a monkey was climbing through the window, and I chased off the monkey and then told my wife the next morning this dream I had about chasing monkeys. And it turned out it actually was a bear trying to get in. So I feel pretty brave having stared down and defended my wife from this attacking bear. But let's pray and we'll dive in. Heavenly Father, we commit this time to you and ask for your blessing on it. Particularly pray for this faculty and staff in the year that lies ahead. I pray that your spirit would be mighty on them and in them as they minister to these students. And I pray that this time would be useful in preparing for that time. In your son's name we pray. Amen. So I have the job of sort of addressing this topic of purpose. And I think I get 2 talks. So I'm going to try to make them 40 minutes each or so with a little break in between. It's going to take a little while, but I think you'll see this builds to address purpose. But just give me a moment. Be patient with me as we get there. I want to start with a encounter I had with a student at the University of Idaho back when I first graduated from U of I was going to be a high school chemistry teacher, which it is funny that I am now in the job that I'm in. It has nothing to do with chemistry. But when I graduated, my first job was actually doing evangelism to University of Idaho students. And so I was up on the campus every day trying to spark evangelistic conversations with these students. And I remember one time running to the student, and most of the time I would just get blown off pretty quickly. But this one student was really interested in talking, and I remember him really challenging me with this question. And this question goes something like this. Doesn't it seem like the noblest acts, the acts that are most worthy of admiration, are those acts that are done without any regard for being noticed by others? Like when you do something solely for the goodness of that thing itself, not to get other people's praise, but just because this is the right thing to do. The truly good deeds are the ones that you do while not caring whether other people notice what you're doing, right? And I initially was like, that sounds right. And it doesn't just sound right, it sounds biblical, right? Jesus warns us about doing charitable deeds to be seen. Matthew 6, we get this. Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Or think of his warning about praying to be seen, praying in such a way to get other people's attention. And when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. So it seemed to me that his opening premise was one that, as a Christian, I would agree with. But once I had granted the truth of the premise, he turned it back onto Jesus. Because if that is the case, his argument was, if that is the case, why do we have to recognize what Jesus did on the cross in order to receive salvation? Why does God want recognition for what he has done to save us? Why does he require that we praise him for all of his works? If the truly good deeds are those that are done without any regard for being noticed, wouldn't it have been better if God had just given the gift of salvation to the world without demanding that we notice that he did it? Jesus dies on the cross. You're all saved, and it doesn't matter whether you accept him into your heart. It doesn't matter whether you praise him or thank him. It's done totally separated from your acknowledgement of the salvation. Why does he demand that we praise him and worship him for it? And unfortunately, just as I had felt a quick agreement with the premise, I found myself really feeling the full weight of this objection, because I knew, even as a Christian, even more than he did as a non-Christian, how much our gathering together is oriented around praising God for what he has done. If you just think back to the songs that we were singing just a little bit ago, we gather together to praise God for what he's done, and we do so in obedience to his word, calling that praise out of us. To God be the glory, great things he has done. The hymn sings. Our songs, our prayers, our sermons, they're all catalogs of God's works, praising him for them. Think of just the pattern that is set for us in the Psalms. You know, if you read through the Psalms again and again, if his principle is valid, then I feel like 2/3 of the book of Psalms is in violation of that principle. So if I granted the first principle that truly good deeds are those that are done without a desire for an audience, then why was God expecting us to praise him for what he has done? I walked away from that with this new kind of like little theological or intellectual conundrum, and I referred to it as the problem of worship. You've got the problem of evil, these kind of classic objections to the Christian faith. You've got the problem of evil. How can an all-powerful, all-good God allow evil to exist in this world? And you have to work through that. But this is, in my mind, becomes the problem of worship. Why does God command for us to worship him for his actions when it seems like truly good actions should be performed without any desire to be seen? And what was interesting is as I started to formulate this problem of worship, you started to see it everywhere. It really is all around. And it is, I think it wasn't just this one guy's insightful observation. This is actually an objection that, though not put as precisely as he did, I think it's around us all the time. Think of the 10 Commandments, how it's easy to take a non-Christian through the second half of the 10 Commandments. You divide it into the two tables, the second half, which is Command 6 through 10. And there's generally like a pretty initial, yeah, that's right. You're not supposed to kill people. You shouldn't steal. You shouldn't lie. And in fact, they would object to saying that this is a distinctively Christian thing, because we all know that even if we're not Christians, the law of God, I understand it, this is how they got there. The law of God's written on their hearts, so they understand not to commit murder, not to steal. That's easy. But the first half, the first table of the 10 Commandments introduces these things that are actually oriented towards the worship of God. And the ones that are oriented towards the worship of God are ones that there's a tendency to like, I don't understand the need for that. In fact, it seems to me that God is being self-centered and egotistical to demand this kind of worship from us. The commands that describe God as set apart and unique and prescribe a worship that we are to give to him alone. And this demand that we give God worship, it deeply offends, I think, the unregenerate heart. Similarly, when Jesus gave the two great commandments, he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, quoting Deuteronomy 6:5, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18. The second of those two commandments, the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, again, it's one of those that it's easy to get people who aren't Christians to agree that that's a good moral teaching. You see it replicated in various other faiths, some sort of similar formulation of that golden rule. But in Jesus' teaching, our obligations to our fellow man come after our obligation to worship God, to love him with all your heart, soul, and mind. And something much greater there. You should notice that something much greater is being claimed for God. To my neighbor, I'm supposed to treat him like I would want to be treated. To my God, I'm to love him with everything. Everything is to be committed to him. I owe all love. He demands a total monopoly of my attention. So is this, I'm trying to make this as sharp as possible here. Is this a problem with God? Why couldn't he be content with just Jesus' second commandment? Love me like you would like yourself to be loved, okay? Why is there a separate and distinct commandment to love God with this kind of devotion? Why couldn't God have just argued for the same even distribution of love that my neighbor gets? If you listen to atheists very much, if you listen back in the day when you had like Dawkins and Hitchens and Sam Harris, and they would write these like scathing critiques of Christianity. And one of the things that they will always focus on is they would say that God has a narcissism problem because he demands this kind of attention from us. So is this a problem with God? So this is a rough summary of the problem, and I imagine there are a number of different answers to this objection, but I'm going to sketch out the three that came to me as I thought through this question for some time. So I'm going to give you three possible ways that I see this can be resolved. And I'm hopeful that by the time we get to the end, you will have seen this theme of purpose kind of emerge as something that's actually quite essential to understanding why God is like this. The first one, let me give you a story. It was mentioned when we were in Oxford. We lived in England for a number of years, and our pastor told this analogy a number of times. Since then, I've seen it elsewhere, so this might be like really too commonplace. You've all heard it 14 times, but if you've already heard it, please just play along. So this was the story he tells. He says, a British battleship is cruising through the dark seas on a stormy night. Suddenly a light appears on the very near horizon, dead ahead and directly in the path of the vessel. The captain of the battleship ordered a flashed Morse code signal to be sent to the approaching vessel to turn aside. The vessel sent a message back saying, "You turn aside." The captain of the battleship had not been promoted to the rank which he now held by being a pansy. So he quickly ordered the very same direct message sent once more, "Turn aside." After a short distance, the very swiftly approaching light on the horizon replied with the same rebuff, "You turn aside." And though the distance was closing fast, the captain felt it was important to not set a cowardly precedent and ordered one more message sent, one that was sure to make clear to the other vessel just who was going to come out on top of this in this game of nautical chicken. "We are the HMS Dreadnought, flagship of the British fleet, turn aside." To which the answer came, "We are a lighthouse. You turn aside." So this is the theology geek in me that says, I think the message of this anecdote is that ontology matters. Okay, ontology matters. The word ontology from the Greek word ontos, which refers to being or existence. So ontology is the study of what sort of being or existence you are. God's existence, if we discuss the ontology of God, God's existence is eternal, all right, and self-sustaining. He causes himself to be. And he is forever and has been forever with himself as the source of his own being. He doesn't depend on anyone or anything for his existence. Mankind, all of us, on the other hand, we exist because God called us into being. He spoke us into being. So you see, there's two very different kinds of ontology there, two different kinds of being. One who is self-existent, causes himself to be and eternal, and those of us that are, you might call contingent, right? Our existence is contingent upon God bringing us about and holding us together. Paul in Acts 17 says this to the men of Athens: "God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives life to all, breath, and all things." Our being, our existence comes from him. We are ontologically dependent on him. God, on the other hand, depends upon no one for his existence. He exists on his own and is ontologically independent. In God, there is no variation or shadow of turning. James 1:17. We change. He doesn't. He changes never. He is immutable. Or as the hymn says, there's no shadow of turning with thee. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever will be. That's one of the great comforts we have, is that God's mercy, because it comes from someone who is unchanging, his mercy is not this favor that's here for today and not here for tomorrow. It's anchored in who he is, and he is unchanging. He is the one, as we're told in Acts 17, in whom we live and move and have our being. Our being is contingent. It depends upon him. We do not cause ourselves to exist as he does. We depend on him to cause our existence, but God is self-existence. C.S. Lewis says this in his book on miracles. He says, God is so brimful of existence that he can give existence away, can cause things to be and to be really other than himself, can make it untrue to say that he is everything. So, going back to my problem of worship, the first answer to the problem of worship is to note the ontological distinction between mankind and the Creator, who spoke us into existence and who continues to uphold us by the power of his word. To speak of the devotion that I owe to my Maker as if it ought to measure out to be identical in quality and quantity to the devotion that I owe to my human neighbor is ridiculous. To think about the ontological divide between us and to say, oh, my obligations here are the same as my obligations across that ontological divide to the one who is self-existent. And when Jesus taught about the command to love our neighbors, he gave us the golden rule. What you want to do unto you, do also, what you want men to do unto you, do also to them. So in order to apply this rule, if you think about the way the golden rule works, you have to stop and you have to run this little mental exercise first, right? You must ask yourself, what do I believe that others ought to be doing to me? So you have to take a moment and imagine you're in somebody else's mind and you're going to say, what should that person be doing to me? What is owed to me? And then you flip it back and say, that's what I owe to them now. You flip around and make what was the burden that you imagined was on others towards you into a burden that is now on you towards others. That works fine when I'm dealing with my neighbor who is another human and shares my ontological nature. But the whole thing falls apart when I attempt to apply it to God. Because that little mental exercise needs to first leap the ontological divide that lies between myself and God. I have to imagine myself as the eternally existent one, right? You have to imagine that and then use that, what I get while I'm over there to then decide what I owe to others. But you can't make that leap. You can't jump across that chasm into the ontology of God. It works fine when I'm dealing with my neighbor who is another human and shares my nature, but the whole thing falls apart when I attempt to apply it to God. Because that little mental exercise needs to first leap the ontological divide that lies between myself and God. And what I mean is that I must first say, if I was God and I was the eternally self-sufficient one, and I called this whole world into existence, and I believe and I breathed life into that one chump on the college campus up at the University of Idaho, and I am sustaining him right now by my power, if all of that was the case, what would be right for me to expect from him? Okay, that's very different than the way we do the golden rule when we're talking to other humans. And I'd say no human is equipped to answer that question based merely on their own intuition. Why? Because when you speak for how God should behave and what he should expect, you have no idea what you're dealing with. This was, to go back to my analogy there, this was the mistake that the captain of the British battleship made. Seeing the looming light on the horizon, he could only imagine that the light came from a vessel with the same properties as himself. That this meant that it was a vessel that could move, that could be bullied and could be intimidated, a vessel that could be threatened and forced to back down with his own show of bravado. But in actuality, he was dealing with something entirely different, something fixed and unmoving, something dangerous, something that wasn't just, you think about this for that lighthouse was not just unthreatened by that battleship, but he was actually showing mercy to the battleship by telling him to turn aside. It wasn't a show of bravado. It was an act of grace and mercy to say, turn. You don't know what you're approaching. You don't know what you're dealing with. He was incapable of being threatened and was actually showing mercy by trying to warn him of the danger of their collision. The captain did not understand what he was dealing with. So you have to go back to that question, that person who's arguing with God. Do you really believe that you're equipped to make the mental leap from humanity to divinity? Do you know enough about what these properties of the Godhead feel like to know what they would be owed? Do you know enough about what it's like to have brought something into existence from nothing to know what sort of devotion should be expected of that creature? This is where God's words to Job in Job 38, I think, become really helpful. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it?" And if you remember reading on, Job, wise man that he is, finally says, "I'm just going to cover my mouth now. I'm going to back away. I didn't know who I was talking with." We do not know what it is to be the creator. We are not in a position to run the golden rule experiment upon him. When atheists see God as a divine narcissist, they are betraying that they have not adequately considered the God that we are speaking about. They refuse to consider God as their maker and instead conceive of him as some kind of comic minor deity. And it's easy to conceive of that mini God as insecure and vain because they fashioned him in their own imagination. It's no different than themselves, like the battleship, imagining it's another battleship on the horizon. They don't realize the ontological difference between themselves and that looming light on the horizon. But as I said, ontology matters. Right? Ontology matters. So that's the first answer I would give to that problem of worship is ontology matters. Let me give a second one. Implicit in the phrasing of the problem of worship is the assumption that praising and worshiping God, giving him the devotion that is owed to him, would be a laborious task while at the same time it's some sort of pleasurable treat for God. When you think of the problem of worship phrased the way it is, it acts as if worship is like us. When we worship God, it's like us giving him a giant foot rub, right? It's all effort and sacrifice down here where we're laboring in our worship, but it's making God happy up in heaven where he receives it. Or perhaps it's as if we come to worship God like the weary audience of a very like a pianist with a fragile ego, right? Somebody who's performing on stage, but they have a very fragile ego. We have to applaud and applaud and applaud after every painful piece in order to not damage this guy's brittle self-esteem. Okay, well, that's I think the way people are conceiving of worship when they have the objection that I'm describing. But what if it went the other way around? Okay, what if worship went the other way around? What if the command to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind was actually God giving us a gift instead of the other way around? What if it was him extending to us an invitation to something exquisite rather than us performing for him? Remember, he is the self-sufficient one. He's the eternally self-sufficient one. He's not like the pagan gods of the ancient world who needed the sacrifice of bulls and goats in order to feed them. Whatever it is that we are giving to God when we worship him, we are not giving him something that he was lacking before we started. We're not sustaining him with our worship. Rather, we are the ones that depend upon him. And I think it's actually more likely that in the worship of God, rather than supplying God with something that he was missing, he's actually giving to us something that we are missing. What if the command to worship God was not actually what if the command to worship God was actually an invitation to a feast? An invitation to a feast. What if we are not the weary audience of the insecure pianist, but rather we are the famished guests of the great chef? Right? We're being invited to something that sustains us, that lifts us up, that nourishes us. We've been told to sit down and begin tasting what our chef has prepared for us. That's certainly the perspective of King David when you start to read the Psalms. Psalm 34. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good, he promises. Psalm 34, verse 8. He longed deeply for the pleasure of being with God in worship. Psalm 63. Oh God, you are my God. Early I will seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water. So I have looked for you in the sanctuary to see your great power and your glory. David found the greatest and most lasting pleasure that he could imagine, all realized in the worship of God. Psalm 16, in your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. The command to worship God is actually an invitation to experience the greatest blessing that God can give to us. Rather than the insecure pianist demanding that we clap for him, God is the great chef who's invited us to sit down at his banquet table and to feast with him. The feast is the worship. And in receiving an invitation to come and join him, he has given something to us rather than demanded something from us. It's a gift to us rather than a demand for us, the demand upon us. Okay, so there's a couple ways now you've seen where, worship, it actually is a kindness from God to invite us into it. But now I want to pull it into this sense of purpose and how worship is this thing that orients your life and gives your life purpose. And it's a very important kind of purpose that it gives, something that your life really needs. I'm going to point this whole approach. I'm going to point out that this whole approach to the problem of worship is completely messed up with this other invented scenario. And and it's slightly offensive, but I think it's helpful. Okay, imagine for a moment that you're standing in the lobby of a very fine hotel. The entire lobby is marble, and you can tell at a glance that their weekly bill for the florist is more than your monthly mortgage. The hotel staff are impeccably dressed and attentive to every guest's smallest need. In walks a man with a beautiful woman on his arm. She's wearing an expensive gown and has a small fortune in jewelry hanging from her ears, neck, and wrists, all gifts from the man on whose arm she hangs. They have come from a fine dinner followed by the ballet, her favorite, and are headed now to a room that he booked for her months ago at this exclusive hotel to mark a special occasion. Throughout the crowded lobby, he only has eyes for her and manages to anticipate her every need. A woman standing next to you at the counter, somewhat jealous of the attention that this other woman is getting, says to no one in particular, "There is a man who knows how to treat a lady right." The busboy, overhearing her comment, answers, "Too bad it's his secretary and not his wife." Oops. You hear that, and all of a sudden, what was initially like, that's such an exquisite and fine moment, and all of a sudden, it becomes grotesque and reprehensible. Right? It becomes what at first seemed to be an impressive display of romantic love suddenly becomes totally violent, an actual betrayal of love, right? But here's the thing that I want you to see, and this is the really important point. I didn't change your picture of what was happening at all. I did not change what he was doing. All the verbs stay the same. None of the verbs were updated, altered, or changed. What he was doing stays the same throughout. He is still there with the woman, showering her with attention. He has still spent all the money on her. He still has eyes only for her. All of that has stayed the same. I've not changed the verbs in the story at all. Instead, I changed the direct object in the story. Okay? In other words, I did not change what he was doing. I changed to whom he was doing it. I changed the direct object, who it was for. And the changing of the direct object, the changing of who it was for, suddenly recast the story completely. Even though nothing has changed about what he was doing, the whole story is different because we changed for whom he was doing it. He's still being a gentleman, but he is being a gentleman to the wrong woman. And it's not like you suddenly learned that he was actually planning on murdering the woman that evening. He still had all the same plans for her that night. But the realization that he is with the wrong woman makes those exact same actions vile. In fact, the more loving and tender and caring he is to her, the more vile he becomes in your eyes. It makes it worse, not better. The more thoughtful, the more loving, it gets worse and worse. The lesson here is that the moral character of our actions is not clear until we know something about the object of our actions. For instance, we tend to act like love is in itself a virtue. And we live in an age where this is constantly, everything is branded with this word love, but it's all verb. And there's a strong insistence that you can't specify the direct object of what is being loved. Love is just love, and it's by itself something that we're supposed to believe is right. We tend to act like love is in itself a virtue, but you do not know if love is virtuous until you know what is being loved. Do you love your neighbor? Do you love your wife? Pizza? The music of Led Zeppelin? Kicking puppies? Baal worship? Flying planes into skyscrapers? You do not know if love is a virtue or a vice until you know what is being loved. Is the man loving his wife or his mistress? The direct object of the love matters, not just the verb, love. Okay? And I hope that at this point you can see that I've been building up to address this question of purpose. That is the theme here for the year. Purpose is when we specify what is the direct object of the verb. And just as without the clarity of the direct object, your verb is largely meaningless, so too without the clarity of purpose for why you're doing what you're doing, your labors become more and more meaningless unless you have that clarity of purpose. Now, with this realization in mind, we can return back to that problem of worship. You might not have noticed it earlier, but when at the very beginning, I actually cheated. I read for you from Matthew 6, where Jesus was talking about, don't do your charitable deeds, but I actually deleted a few sentences because if you read it in its entirety and pay close attention, I think that the answer to the objection of the problem of worship is right there in Jesus' original words. Let me read you again Matthew 6, 1 through 4, with all of it there. Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. Right? What you see there it was the two things that I had deleted earlier was a reference to the reason why we do these things in secret is so that it's obvious to us that it's done for God and for God alone. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven, or your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. Jesus did not teach that we should not want an audience for our charitable deeds. At the very beginning, that premise that I set up, it was flawed. There was something problematic with it. This idea that we do a good deed for the sake of the good deed itself. No, that's not what Jesus teaches here. He does not teach that we should not want an audience for our charitable deeds. Rather, he actually taught that we should want the right audience for our deeds. We should be very clear who this is being done for, right? That we want to know who is the true sole audience for our obedience. You avoid doing your deeds for the sake of other men. Okay? We avoid doing our good deeds in front of other people, giving gifts in public so that everybody will praise me for what I did, praying in this elaborate fashion to get attention from other people. We avoid doing that not because you're not supposed to have an audience, but because I want God to be my sole audience. I want the giving of that gift to be for him and for him alone. I want my prayers to be for him and for him alone. And when we start doing our deeds in front of other people, the crowds start to obstruct our vision of God. They start to get in our way of our true purpose. You avoid doing your good deeds for the sake of other men because they tend to block your view of the Father in heaven. You can be a man pleaser or you can be a God pleaser, right? You can be a man pleaser or you can be a God pleaser, and you need to pick which you're going to be. Because if you start deciding, I'm doing this in order to get other people's attention, you will not be a God pleaser. And when you say, I'm going to do this for God and for God alone, you'll stop caring what other people think, right? It tends to be this path that divides, and you go in one way or the other. You cannot be both. So put the opinion of other men out of your mind so that you can please God and God alone. I think when you see that, okay, that my life is oriented towards him, to serve him, to glorify him, that becomes the overarching purpose that gives clarity and meaning to everything else in your life. Like the man who's treating this woman right, you've got to figure out who is the bride, who is the one that you want to serve. And if you have the right direct object, all of your love becomes glorious and beautiful and loving and caring and really true. God is the one whom we serve, and when we have him as our defined purpose, then everything else is oriented by that. So the whole premise of the problem of worship, I think, is flawed. It is not the case that the truly good deeds are the ones that are done with no thought of who is watching. The truly good deeds are actually the ones which are done solely for God to see. When you give a gift in secret, knowing that God alone is the only witness to your generosity, or when you fast in secret, knowing that only God is paying attention to it, when your obedience is given in such a way that only God sees it, that's what true faith looks like. That's true faith. The mere appearance of godliness, if I just put on a display of godliness that impresses you all, well, the appearance of godliness can always be leveraged before the world to get you respect and admiration from other men, right? If you appear to have a certain kind of piety, then that is something you can always leverage to manipulate people because you've got their respect and admiration and you can manipulate them. But when you deliberately deny yourself the respect and admiration of men, and instead you offer your obedience to God alone, that is when you're walking in deep faith. When you concentrate on being content to hear the well done of your Father alone by deliberately just not giving a rip for the admiration of the world. that's when you have oriented your life in this faithful way. Think of it this way. God is the one who makes sense of all our obedience, okay? All of your obedience, all good deeds that you do, it starts to make sense when it is oriented towards God in worship, that this is for him. If you remove him, if this is not for him, and you're just doing good deeds for the sake of admiration or whatever, all of your obedience becomes polluted. And suddenly you start to see that how worship takes this primary place in orienting all of your life. The way you treat your wife, the way you lead your classroom, the way you handle the finances of the school, all of these things, once your worship is clear, then all of these things are oriented towards that. If you remove God as the purpose for all of your work here becomes corrupt. And it may be on the outside, other people can't see it, because it may be like the man with the woman on his arm in the hotel lobby that everybody looks at and thinks, this is a wonderful, beautiful moment. But if it's not being done for the right one, it becomes corrupt. And when it's done for the right one, it all gets oriented and it starts to click and be what it's supposed to be. God is the one who makes sense of all of our obedience. To remove him, to say, okay, I don't want to get God's attention for my obedience. To remove him would not make our good deeds nobler, okay? Rather, it would make them nonsensical. To remove God as the object for our worship doesn't make them noble. It makes them nonsense. Remove God from this world and then ask yourself, what is the right thing to do? Remove God from this world and then say, now what is obedience? What is the right thing to do? Remove his revealed word. Remove all of his commandments. Remove the law that's been written on your hearts, that natural sense that we all have for discerning between right and wrong, which even though we can't quite explain how we know the difference between good and evil, yet we still all know it. Remove all of that. Remove God's fingerprint on your heart. And then ask, what does it mean to do good? Okay? You will find that you are left without an answer. If there is no God, then what is good? Or as Dostoevsky once observed, if God is dead, then all things are permissible. Remove God, there's no such thing as obedience. So if we remove God from our considerations, we will find out that we have not made ourselves nobler. Rather, we have destroyed the possibility of nobility. It doesn't even exist as a category once he's gone. Because you see, if there's no singular ruler over all creation, then creation has no rule. If there is no one single lawgiver, then creation has no ultimate law. But if there are no rules and there are no laws, then there's no such thing as someone who is obeying or doing good. It would be like trying to run a race without a clock, an opponent, or a finish line. You might be running, but you aren't racing. God provides the context for our obedience. His character defines for us the standard for obedience. Without him, there's no such thing as obedience. But when we see him and when we understand who he is, then we understand what we must be. We understand how we must act. Right? He supplies the purpose for everything when we see him as he is. So do you see why it is that when God gives us his law, I think it's interesting that when his law is given to us, it's always oriented in the order that I was pointing out at the beginning. He starts with the commands that address worship. Okay, the first table of the law, worship God. The two laws, that you have the golden rule and the second law, but the first law is to love God. Right? God, when he's going to teach you obedience, he starts with worship. Worship is the beginning of all obedience because worship gives the context and meaning to all obedience. He starts with the commands that address worship because before you can have obedience, you have to recognize the standard for your obedience. You have to recognize the object for your obedience. When we worship God, we're recognizing that he is worthy to be considered the ultimate standard for all morality. First, we recognize him as worthy of being the standard for our obedience, and then we apply his standard to our lives. Right? I love God with all my heart, soul, and mind. I love him with everything. And then now that I'm there, I say, oh, he would have me love my neighbor as myself. All right? And then I apply that to my neighbor, but I start with that love of God, that worship of God. Worship establishes the true and final object of our obedience, God alone. He is the one whom our eyes are on when we obey. He is the one true object of our obedience. He is our ultimate purpose. What is the chief end of man? The Catechism asks. To glorify God and enjoy him forever. It's not just significant that the Catechism identifies God as our chief end, the Westminster Catechism, if you've gone through that. It identifies God as our chief end. The chief end of man, glorify God and enjoy him forever. But I think it's really meaningful that question is question number one. You must start here, right? This is where you have to orient yourself first of all. My purpose is to serve him, to love him, to obey him. Then everything else can make sense in the light of that. Identifying our purpose begins and orients everything to follow. To work a good work in an attempt to please anyone but the God who made us is to act like the adulterous man in the hotel lobby. You do not obey to impress your neighbor because he is not your God. All true obedience starts by fixing our eyes on God alone. That is why the law begins with worship. We start with hallelujah, and then we move on to thou shalt not. Okay, that's the order you ought to proceed in. Before you can truly love your neighbor, you must first love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. This means that a faithful life is a life that begins with defining your purpose. It's a life that is lived before the omniscient gaze of God, anxious to please him alone, wanting only to hear his well done. It's a life that begins with worship and then proceeds from there to obey all his commandments. So I say we want to have our eyes on him alone. Obviously, we want to treat our neighbors with love, but we do that first because we've established this correct orientation before anything else. And that is our ultimate purpose. I think I'm at a convenient breaking point. So let me just close in prayer, and then I think we take a 10-minute break. Is that a 5-minute break? And then we'll be back again. So I'll close in prayer, and then we'll be back shortly. Father, we continue to commit this time for you. We are grateful that you are the direct object of our worship, that you orient everything, and this is actually a great gift and grace to us. I pray that we'd continue to consider this as we move forward. In your son's name, amen. Okay, I think we're back. Let's pray one more time. Heavenly Father, we continue to commit this time to you and ask for your blessing as we push into the second half. May you be glorified and you be edified. Praise things in your son's name. Amen. So, moving on, I'm gonna go back just a little bit before that evangelistic encounter on the U of I campus. I was just commenting to somebody earlier, never saw the kid again, and it's like the answer occurs to me about 10 years later. So I never got to actually. It was one of those classic way homer moments where you come up with that would have been a really good answer, but it was useful to me. So I want to go back a little bit before that. Right after I graduated high school, actually, I enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserves straight out of high school. So I was just in the reserves, but the unit that I was attached to in Boise was a tank unit. So I went in as a tank crewman, and so throughout college, I did the classic GI Bill thing, 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer and a GI Bill to get through college, which was great, and also got the experience of being in the Marine Corps, which is also very interesting. But what was particularly interesting was every 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer, we go out on drive tanks around and the desert outside of Boise, and then in the summer we would come to Trinity Palms here in California, luxurious place, and get to drive around for a couple of weeks. But it seemed to me that almost all of our time when we were out on the tanks, you seemed to spend about 99% of your time sighting in the gun tube again and again. You would go out and you'd have to sight it in, and you would do that for hours. Then you shoot a couple times, and then you got to sight it in again. And we spent forever always sighting in the gun tube. And I was on the M1A1, 120 millimeter smoothbore cannon, very impressive weapon. You can. It's effective at 2,000 meters, and you can do it on the move with laser, just range finding, all this stuff. It's very cool. But in order to hit your target, you had to always be sighting in your gun tube again and again. And that's because if you think of the length of that cannon. When you're firing over, say, 2,000 meters, the slightest deviation in the angle of the cannon will cause the shell initially, 100 meters, it might only be an inch or two off. But as you are aiming at something like 2,000 meters or even beyond, okay, that little, it was just off an inch or so at 100 meters. Well, now at 200 meters, now that's 4 inches. And now, and it doubles each time you increase that length. And so your shell gets further and further away. So what was just a slight little deviation can have you completely off the target at the range that you're shooting at. And with that size of a gun tube, the heat of the day would cause it to like just droop a little bit. Or if you're driving and bouncing along the road, it would cause it to shift a little bit from where your sights were. And that's why you had to always be sighting in your gun again and again and again. And this is the thing, this is the little lesson I kind of took away from it, was the realization that when you're aiming at something very close, minor deviations are no big deal. Like when you're really, really close, you can be off a good bit and still inflict the damage that you want. When you were shooting with your 9mm at a target that was 10, 15 meters away, you could be all over the place and you're still doing damage. But when you're aiming for something over a long distance, you have to start taking greater and greater care of your aim. It becomes more and more important that you be tighter and tighter on your aim. And little things that you would normally dismiss, like the heat of the sun on your gun tube causing it to droop just slightly. You would never think of that when you're at a short distance. But at a long distance, those minor insignificant things become really, really important. And I want to apply that observation to the Christian life. Hebrews 12 tells us this, 12:2. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. We are looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. When we set something other than Christ as our final purpose, or when we set a confused purpose for ourselves by trying to blend a vision of Christ with something supplied by our carnal imagination, we set ourselves on a twisted path that will eventually lead us away from Christ. And because I want to encourage you to think in terms of the long distance of your Christian life, not the rest of this week, not the rest of this month, but the long distance of your Christian life. That means that if you want your eyes to be on Christ, you have to apply an uncommon discipline to having clarity in your purpose. So take a little lesson about the gun tube and think about how that applies to the clarity of your purpose. If you have only a short distance to go in your life, you can have pretty messed up sights and still persevere in your faith relatively well. But if you continue on with those messed up sights, if you go beyond a few short months of Christian living and try to reach something like 80 or 90 years of a faithful life, you will discover that something that at first seemed like a small but tolerable deviation in your aim slowly becomes a life that is further and further off the target of long-term faithfulness. It's interesting, you are celebrating, did I hear right, this is your 24th year? Yeah, you're almost a quarter of a century as an institution. You're no longer in those early startup months. You're well past that. You're as old or older than most of the classical Christian schools in the U.S. You have considerable legacy already, and you should be thinking in terms of long term. What does it take for us to maintain our purpose long term? And I want to argue it means having an uncommon attention to small details that will pull you off in the long term. As a Christian, my goal is not simply to serve Christ for today. My goal is to serve Christ for my whole life. I don't want to hit my target at a mere 50 meters. I want to hit my target at 2,000 meters. I want to lay on my deathbed at the end of my life and have the same view that Stephen had as he passed into glory. Acts 7:56. Look, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. I think it's particularly poignant for him to describe the sight. Like if you set your sight on Christ and the reward that he sees at the end as he passes over to the other side is, and there he is, right? What a glorious way to finish. I want to finish my years with my eyes still focused on their target, beholding the Son of Man. And at the end of the arc of my life, however long that life may be, I want to still be dead on target. Center mass, as the Marine Corps sharpshooter might say. At the end of his life, Paul could boast, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me at the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day, and not to me only, but also to all who have loved his appearing. It is a boast that we all ought to long to make, to be able to brag like that. Now, anyone that actually lands on that faithful bullseye will look back and see that all of this is a gift of grace from God, a gift that robs him of boasting in himself. This isn't a arrogant kind of boasting. Nevertheless, the knowledge that this perseverance is 100% a precious gift from God doesn't stop Paul from glorying in his crossing that finish line. He could go across glorying at how he is still on target. And I think this should be all of our deep desire as well, both individually, corporately, and for this institution. You should desire to hold this long-term on that purpose that we described in the previous talk. The Christian life is a race. We see that image in multiple places. It's an ongoing struggle to persevere in faithfulness. But look at the glorious reward. Remember Jesus' parable of the talents. At the end, he describes the powerful blessing of hearing the Father say, well done, good and faithful servant. To be able to say to the one who invested wisely, who stood faithfully, and then he gets to stand before the Father, and the Father says, well done, right? You did that well. That's something we're supposed to want to hear, it should inspire you to strive to hear the Father say that to you. That well done of the Father. Trouble. And we're driving along as a family, and I was telling my wife that I can't remember if Jimmy was going into jail or Jimmy was getting out of jail or Jimmy called me from jail. It was something in Jimmy's life and it involved jail. And my son Judah is in the back seat. He's like 5 or 6 years old. And he said, it just doesn't seem like it's that hard to not go to jail. It seems like you can do that. You can live your life in a way that doesn't get you in prison. And I remember just thinking, yeah, it's true, but not for Jimmy. It's really hard for Jimmy to make it through a weekend without getting into that kind of trouble. And there are just people that are like that. You'll have students like that. Like this one will just always, the sin will be there, big, in front of you, and obvious, okay? There are some sins that go before. Everybody knows about it. But Paul said, then there are some sins that follow later. There are some sins that are these quiet, private sins that follow later. They don't reveal themselves until the round has traveled far downrange. right? There are some sins that's like you're off target in the first 10 feet. But then there are some sins that this is something that you can go 500 meters and people think you're still on target. But it's slowly pulling you off. They seemed like they had such a happy little family. But when their kids graduated from high school and moved out of the house, and suddenly the marriage falls apart, the financial decisions become spastic and desperate, deep resentments that no one knew about start to surface, alcohol, which had never been a temptation before, suddenly becomes a powerful snare, and they find no joy in worshiping with the saints, and they leave church after church after church. And it's this, you can see this is going bad, but it had been going right for so long, and I don't understand why it's like that. And I would say we seasoned saints. Okay, those of you we've been in the faith for a long time. I grew up in a private Christian school. Kindergarten through 8th grade, I went to private school. My mom was a kindergarten teacher. I grew up in the evangelical church. I grew up inside of this world. I would consider myself sort of a seasoned saint. My guess is most of you have that kind of background. And we seasoned saints are very adept at, we know how to avoid the sins that fall into the first category. We can see them a mile away. For us, it's not hard to get through the week without going to prison. We know how to stay out of those sins. It's not a big deal. It's not get arrested this weekend. So we can stay out of those sins that are clearly evident, those sins that are in front and everybody sees, but all the while, we privately cultivate the sins from the second category, those that follow later. We cultivate these private little disobediences. I can remember as a kid, so I grew up in Boise, Idaho, and I can remember as a kid, it was a weird joke that we would play. And my friend had some fishing line, and he lived out in the country, and we would go and we would tie fishing line across the road from fence post to fence post, and then hide in the ditch, and a car would drive through the fishing line, and the fishing line would snap. How is that fun? I have no idea. I don't know why we did it. I don't think any of the cars even noticed that they were snapping fishing line. It was a stupid thing we would do. But it was Idaho in the early 80s, and the bar for entertainment was pretty low. Very pre-internet and all that. But this is this little thing that we would do. And until my friend, here's another neighborhood kid who comes over and starts doing this with us. And you know how there's always that one kid that doesn't know when to stop, that takes something like this was this innocent little thing and they turn it into like a real problem. And it's always really awkward when that kid is in your group because he's going to get you all in trouble really quick. Well, this guy, he goes and he gets fishing line from his dad, and it was like deep sea fishing, like ridiculous for pulling in swordfish or something like that. Goes back and forth multiple times on the road, and this truck hits it, and he had tied it off, I think, to on the house, the electrical service. He yanked the electrical service off the house. Siding is coming out, sparks, and he got into all kinds of trouble. And the thing is I was a Christian kid who grew up knowing how to see we're doing something a little bit naughty, but that's about to be really naughty, and I'm just going to step over here. And so he got in huge trouble, but those of us, and we were the ones that invented the game, we're just standing in the corner, just like, I don't know where he got that idea. And I think that skill is something that many of you know well how to do. We know how to be a little bit naughty, but not stupid naughty, right? We know how to get ourselves into a little bit of trouble and enjoy the thrill of a little bit of disobedience. We also know when that one kid shows up who's going to take it too far, we know how to step back, and then there's the kid who does have trouble staying out of prison in the weekend. And we just stay back and let him have that, it all falls on him. I always refer to this as like that sort of thrill of being naughty adjacent, that thrill of being like, I'm naughty adjacent. So I get the whatever that tingle is of being in a little bit of bad behavior, but I always know how to step back far enough that the real big consequences don't fall on me. And most of us who grew up in the church are pretty adept at the skill of being naughty adjacent. But what I want to, I've identified this, but what I want you to notice is how that does work in the short term. But if we take a step back, we should notice that it almost never works in the long term. It always falls apart in the long term. We know how to dip our toe in, but we know better than to cannonball into the deep end of the sin pool, right? We know how to dip our toe in. We know how to not be the idiot who publicly cannonballs into the pool. We watch the occasional fool implode his life with a very public scandal, and we congratulate ourselves for knowing how to not go too far. This is how, when you do that, though, what I want to point out is this is how you cultivate a quiet discontent in your marriage. This is how you become dissatisfied with your church. This is how you feel increasingly disaffected with your career. Notice each of the things I'm describing here, these are things that happen over years and years and years. They happen in that long 2,000 meter lob of the tank shell. Okay, there are things that happen over a long period of time, and because you're only looking for the deep sins, the very public sins, you don't see these things going on in yourself. But you keep these quiet, private things, and what you find is it becomes very difficult to have something that lasts more than 8 years or 12 years. You know how to make it last for 2 months, 3 months. You can have a really good time, but you can't make it last longer than that. You become disaffected with your career. This is how your love for Christ slowly cools. This is how you're transformed from a joyful young believer into a bitter well of resentment. And you see this happen in your church. There's people who come in as joyful new believers. They've tasted the fresh, wonderful forgiveness of the gospel. But over years, those little sins that follow later accumulate, and they become more and more resentment. They're still coming to church, but they're more and more prickly, difficult, and upset, and feeling everybody is wronging them. John Owen, in his book, I highly recommend The Mortification of Sin. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend The Mortification of Sin, though I will say it's not for the squeamish. If you have a very tender conscience and maybe you wrestle with whether you're a Christian or not, don't read it. He's a very brutal author. He's always saying stuff like, you're probably not even a Christian, and he kind of shreds his readers. But I tend to give it to 18-year-old young men at NSA who need that kind of punch to the nose. But he says this. He says, do you mortify? Do you make it your daily work? Be always at it whilst you live. Cease not a day from this work. Be killing sin, or it will be killing you. And that's his famous, you'll see that quote everywhere. Be killing sin, or sin will be killing you. Setting your eyes on Christ means daily waking up with a desire not just to avoid the kinds of sin that make the front pages of the paper, but also with a desire to find and root out the sins that follow later. The quiet little sins that pull you slowly off target. And I'm wanting to address this because in the first talk I argued that you need to have this clarity of purpose. But now what I'm talking about is how do you hold to that purpose over a long period of time, such that purpose 20 years from now, 30 years from now is still your purpose. And I think Owen tells us how it's done is an uncommon attention to what's going on in your heart, to be killing sin, or else sin will be killing you. You know how it is. Have you ever gone backpacking with a group of friends, and you can always tell the guys for whom this is the first backpacking trip, and you can tell by what they pack, right? There are people who pack, and you can tell right away they are thinking in terms of the luxury and comfort that they want to have at the campsite, and they're putting stupid stuff in their pack. Right? And that's because they don't know what it is to carry this over a long distance. They carried it from their apartment to the car, so they know what it weighed. They just weren't able to project and realize what it would take to hike with this for 20 miles on their back. All right? They have not thought long about how that extra weight is going to weigh them down. And they're putting radios and their iPad and inflatable air mattresses. And they don't know what it's going to do. When you are seasoned, you say, okay, I want to go that far. Therefore, I'm going to pay an uncommon attention to what goes in this pack. I'm not going to let things in that are going to weigh me down. And think of that same thing for your life. If you say, I want to make it all the way to the end, you need to look at what's in your pack and you need to diligently consider what needs to come out for you to make it. When you search your heart, you do so like a man who is packing his backpack for a very long and arduous hike. As we're told in Hebrews, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. All right? Deal with the weight. You don't want to be carrying that weight. Confess the sin, and the weight is out of your pack. And I should just really quickly just mention, when we get the weight out of our pack, because the gospel is true, because Jesus has died on the cross, we get the weight out of our pack by the simple act of confessing. We confess our sins. He's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. It's not some long, you need to go and pay penance. You need to go and do something to atone for it all. It's confess your sin. And it's out of your pack and it's gone because the gospel is true and grace is real. So you confess the sin and the weight is out of your pack. So we must daily address the sins that follow later, the quiet compromises with private sin, which allow our vision of Christ to become mixed with something other than Christ. And I want to address these compromises in two categories that I'll give you for kind of thinking through sins in your life. Two categories. The first is, I'm calling it Canaanite brides, and the second is disordered loves. Canaanite brides. Private sins that we allow to linger on as little guilty pleasures in our life. When Israel entered the promised land, God commanded them to not make peace with certain Canaanite nations, but rather to destroy them utterly. This brutal command came with this explanation in Deuteronomy 20, verse 18. Lest they teach you to do according to all their abominations which they have done for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. Right? There were nations living in the promised land that to make peace with them would fundamentally compromise the Israelites, and they were to brutally drive them out completely, and they were to not intermarry with them, to settle down and make peace with them. But as you know, the Israelites made a forbidden peace with them. And in a very short period of time, the Israelites had turned their back on the one true God and had begun to worship the Canaanite gods. Canaanite worship creeps into the Israelites because they didn't keep that command. King Solomon, famously, we're told, loved many foreign women. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Right? Solomon turns away from following God, and he does so because he did not scrupulously hold to this commandment to not allow foreign wives into his family. Solomon built altars on the southern peak of the Mount of Olives, where sacrifices would be offered to the pagan gods of Ammon and Moab. This is sacrifices that involved child sacrifice. And we got to actually go to Israel this last summer and to actually stand and look, and you can see, looking across the Mount of Olives, you're standing on the Temple Mount and you're looking across, and it's a very short little distance. And at the very end of this mount is this peak that was then later referred to as the Mount of Corruption. And that's where Solomon set up all of these pagan sacrifices. Here you are at this temple, this magnificent temple that served God, and then right there is the Mount of Corruption. God's claim on our heart is total. When we try to make it partial, when we try to reserve a little part of our heart for a private sin that we want to hang on to, these little Canaanite brides, we introduce a compromise that will eventually lead to serious consequences. You can't hold that back. We have excuses for our Canaanite brides. We tell ourselves that these little sins they're so small and so private that they can be held onto without consequence. It's just a sin that follows behind. It's just a sin that follows after it. We don't understand how much it actually is pulling us off target. We comfort ourselves by looking at those people that succumb to sins that follow before, that can't make it through the weekend without getting arrested. We comfort ourselves by saying, well, I'm not that, so I'm doing just fine. But we're not seeing what's actually happening to our sight with the sins that follow behind. Or sometimes we'll tell ourselves that these little sins are actually small rewards for our diligence elsewhere. I'm so scrupulous about this, and this, that it's okay. In fact, it's kind of the little treat I get for my obedience over here. We have lots of explanations and justifications. Nevertheless, at the present moment, these private sins only cause your aim to be off by a fraction of an inch. In the years to come, it will pull you further and further away from Christ. And this is why I'm sure you've been flummoxed by this before, when you've seen families or friends or couples at church who seem so alive with faith and with the gospel and the Christian faith is real in them, and you found inspiration from them. And then over the years, you slowly see this drift to where suddenly they become something that you can't recognize where that came from. And it wasn't like just this moment of disobedience or rebellion. It was just a long, slow cooling. How does that happen? This is how it happens. We tolerate these little things that slowly pull our aim off. Okay, that was the Canaanite brides. The second category I wanted to address was the category of disordered love. This is an even more subtle category than the previous one. The second category is trickier because this kind of sin works to deceive you into thinking that it isn't even wrong. Okay, the first one was, well, it was wrong, but it was so small that it doesn't matter. This one, excuse me, this one is tricky because it doesn't seem wrong. I'm stealing from Augustine a little bit here by describing them as disordered loves. I get the concept from him. It really goes back to Confessions, and you see it elsewhere in City of God. But this idea of the disordered love is what Augustine used to explain how it was that mankind could find sin while living in a world that God created as very good. How can you walk into a world that is, this is all good? God created Adam and Eve good, created the world good. It's all good. How can you find sin in a good world? He explained that what happens is you take a good thing, but you elevate it to a position of significance in your heart that is greater than what it was supposed to have. Okay, so it's not just that everything here is good, but it needs to also stay in the proper order. And you can move the order around and put a good thing in another place into a significance that it ought not to have, and you introduce evil into the world. Here's some examples. Luke 14:26, Jesus says this: "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple." Okay, is it good to be married? Is it good to have a wife? Is it good to have children? Is it good to have parents? Is it good to have friends? All of these are good. But Jesus says, yes, those are all good, but your orientation to them needs to be ordered properly. If your love for your wife outranks your love for Christ, if you don't have that in the right order, which is what I take Jesus to mean when he says to hate your wife, he's saying she needs to be in the right order. You have to be willing to say, I will walk away from you before I would walk away from the gospel. I will not allow this marriage or this relationship to be above Jesus. If you're not ready to do that, then that relationship has become evil. Why would he tell me that I must love my wife in Ephesians 5 and then tell me here that I must hate her? It's because I must order my loves correctly. I must love him first and above all things. And if anything tries to stand between myself and God, then I must be ready to hate that thing, even if the object of my hatred has to be my wife. If she came between me and Jesus, then yeah, she has to go. I'm not going to allow that. To love my wife more than I love God would be to take a good gift, my marriage, and use it to introduce evil into this world by having a disordered love. Okay? When things are not ordered correctly, we take a good world and we introduce evil into it. So remember, the first sin I was saying was when you have a small sin and you excuse it because it's small. Now this is more subtle because these are all good things, and there's verses, there's scripture to argue these are all good things. But when we put them in the wrong order, they become evil. So you must love the right things, but you also must love the right things in the right order. The hard-earned achievements of your career, okay? Hard-earned achievements of your career. Are those good things? Yes. Very, very impressive. They go on your CV. You complete degrees. You write books. You achieve new positions in this institution. You start new programs, and you're achieving in all kinds of different directions. Those are good things. They're the hard-earned achievements of your career. Good things. But if they became something that slowly started to outrank Christ in your life, they are evil. It really is evil, and it's something that you should get rid of and walk away from. Your retirement portfolio saved up by decades of discipline and sacrifice, right? And how hard is it to put together something that will sustain you in later years? You work and you labor and you save and you invest wisely. You deny yourself certain things in order to get there. But is it possible that goal could be something that outranks Christ in your life? A good thing, a wise thing, a responsible thing. And yet suddenly it starts to become this idol that pushes Christ out of your life. Your attention to your health, your attention to your well-behaved children. I think it's interesting. I'm coming from Moscow, Idaho, and if you don't know Moscow, there's a significant teaching ministry there, and a big chunk of the legacy of teaching there has been on family, how to have a good marriage, and how to raise your children in a certain way. And it's really interesting going out and seeing how people take that teaching, which I think was delivered in this good and useful way, but people can really easily turn it into this just kind of noose around their family's neck, right? Where it becomes this idol that completely misses the gospel, completely misses the significance of why are we doing all of this? Like the ultimate goal was to raise these children to love Christ. And if you did all of these, you applied all of the methods, but you made them in the end hate God and want out of your family so badly, that was a mess, and that was just stupid. You are a classical Christian school here. Now, Logos was a classical Christian school. It started in 1980. A long legacy of classical Christian education that's come out of there. But what is the point of the classical Christian education? It's so easy for people to get all the steps right? You did we did the trivium, we did Latin, you did all of these things, and then but it was done as if it was the end, and it missed the end that it was ultimately intended to serve, and it becomes an instrument of Satan, really. I mean, it would be better for these kids to be in public school and all of that than to have this education that is giving them a mistaken conception of what their real purpose is. You want to make sure that all of these things actually serve this true end, or else you get these disordered loves. You take something good and right and praiseworthy, and then you go a little too far with it. You make it the final end. You make it the thing that everything is about. You make it your ultimate goal rather than that well done of the Father at the end. You come to a fork in the road where you have to choose between your savings and your God, and you suddenly discover that you have made those financial goals so important that you can't bear to walk away from the money. And so instead you walk away from your God. That happens again and again. And the tricky thing is, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, is that all these categories of achievement I'm describing are good things. They're really good things. They're commendable things. But all of these categories of obedience only make sense insofar as they are pursued second to God, insofar as they are ordered rightly towards God. The Canaanite bride starts out from the very beginning a forbidden thing. Its power was that it seemed small and excusable. But the power of the disordered love is that it starts out as a virtue that led you into a new temptation. A life of faithfulness and obedience will be under God's blessing. But as God's blessings pile up, once that pile is high enough, it can easily obscure the view that you once had of God. Right? Now, all these blessings are from you pursuing God, but they pile up, and then after a bit, they start to obscure your view of God. And then those blessings, which were tokens of God's goodness, become occasions for temptation and sin. Cotton Mather is famous for this quote. He said, he's describing colonial America, and he said, "Faithfulness begat prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother. Faithfulness begat prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother." There's something really interesting there where faithfulness is good. And because it's good, it produces good things. But we receive those good things, and they're good because they're God's blessings. But when we receive those good things and we allow them to flip our orders of our loves around, then they become temptations that take us away from Christ. And the daughter, prosperity, devours the mother, right? You fall away not because you were doing bad, but you fall away because you were doing so good. You're doing so well. I think that the classical education movement is particularly ripe for this. And I'll say this because a solid education will produce great fruit, and will reap significant material blessings.